Welcome everyone to the Xojo webinar. I am Paul Lefevre, the Xojo Developer Evangelist, and our topic in this webinar is managing screen layouts. So we just got a few slides and then we're going to jump into some example projects, take a look at a few different things, and I'll happily take questions anytime. Just type them into the questions window and I will get to them. So to start with, the first way that Xojo has for managing your layouts is something called control locking. And this is available for both desktop and web layouts. And it allows you to lock your controls to the edges of the layout. So you get a little visual indicator here that shows up in the inspector, and it allows you to choose which edge you want to lock your control to. Web controls also support centering of the control by not locking it to any edge. Then it will stay centered within the layout itself. If you have more complex needs than just locking something to an edge of a layout, you can use the resized and resizing events that are available to you. On desktop, web only has resized, if I remember correctly. And you can use those to put in some custom code that will move the controls around on the layout the way that you want. The other type of layout that is available is something called auto layout. And this is available in iOS. And it allows you to position and size your controls relative to more than just the layout. You can, of course, do the layout itself. And as you can see here, some of the settings that auto layout gives you, quite a bit more. But you can also position things relative to other controls on the layout. And you can also have controls adjust their positioning and size based on the contents of the control. So as you can see, it's quite a bit more powerful than control locking. But it also can be quite a bit more work to set up. And if you've ever used iOS for designing a layouts, you might find sometimes that you might have to fight a little bit with auto layout as these rules, as they're called, get auto created for you when you're dragging things around. And then you usually the best way to deal with that is just to manually set them. But you can do some pretty clever things with auto layout that in desktop and web might require you to implement code in one of the resizing events. And the last thing that can help you with managing your layouts is something called container controls. And these are available for all the main targets, desktop, web, and iOS. And they have different names: container control on desktop, web container on web projects, and iOS container control for iOS. And they allow you to group other controls for essentially reuse on multiple layouts. And it may not always be reuse, actually. You may just want them isolated to simplify the main layout. You know, if you've got, for example, a complicated window with a lot of stuff on it, you may not want to have on that window, you know, hundreds of controls. So you may want to split it into several container controls that are a little more isolated and maybe better focused, giving you a better way to manage the overall layout, not have as many dependencies between things, maybe have the code a little more isolated, that sort of thing. So it certainly can just be for an organizational standpoint as well, rather than reuse. And container controls have a few neat features that you can take advantage of. On desktop, they're very useful with tab panels and page panels. As I mentioned, they can be a great way to just organize your controls so that your main window doesn't have hundreds of controls maybe scattered across multiple tabs or page panels. That can make the control list pretty long, hard to navigate. So splitting that out into different containers can make that a little easier to work with. You can also add container controls dynamically to your windows, which allows you to build perhaps a user interface that, you know, kind of adapts and changes depending on how it's used. On web, container controls have built-in support for scrolling, so they can be a great way to put up some sort of sub-content on a main page and then you can scroll that content itself. You don't have to really do anything special. And of course, you can also add container controls dynamically to web pages, and that can be very useful for all kinds of layouts that you may need to do. Instead of bringing up a new page necessarily, you can just have the single page, create a new container control dynamically, and then use that to show the new layouts. On iOS, you can use container controls in conjunction with the iOS scrollable area control, and this allows you to create essentially a scrollable view. So you'll get an area on the iOS layout that you can scroll around to access all the information that's on the container control. And you can also add iOS container controls dynamically. So let's switch over to Xojo now, and I got a stack of projects, and we're just gonna take a look at a few of them, or take a look at all of them actually, and see what we got. All right, before I jump into too many here, I see there's an initial question from Mike asking that Xojo does not have layout managers, which many other development suites have. Is there any reason? The only reason anything doesn't exist in Xojo is because we haven't added it in most cases, or we don't think it's necessary. On this particular case, I don't know of any specific reason. But if you have specific things that as usual, if you have specific things that you would like to see in Xojo that, maybe from another tool you use or something like that, always create a feedback case so that the engineering team can review and discuss and debate these things. All right, so the first project we have here is a simple one. This is just a simple control locking example. And if I just run it real quick here, you can see the controls are all locked to various edges of the layout. So as I resize it, they all move along with the edges. And you can see how these are positioned. The visual indicator in the inspector, highlights where things are locked, so you can kind of visually see how things might resize. This one's resized to the top and the bottom. This is resized just to the bottom and the edges, and this one's resized to everything so that it'll use the most amount of space. And you can also, in the layout editor itself, just resize to kind of see how things might work and that they're adjusted the way you want. So pretty simple stuff here. Common thing people will do for their initial layouts is to kind of lock things around. If you forget to lock, then your controls just stay wherever you drop them. So if you do have a resizable window, they're not going to move around at all. They're just going to stay right wherever they happen to have been initially positioned. And that, in almost every case, is probably not what you want. So you're going to want to take a look at those locking settings at some point before you get too far along in your project, and then realize that you've got a lot of things to update. The equivalent project to this is the web one, and you can see that it is pretty much exactly the same. You can lock to the edges as before, but one thing you can do in web is you can, I did leave that the way I wanted. You can see I don't have a left or right edge locked here. This means this one's going to stay centered, but it is locked at the top, so it's going to stay attached to the top. You can't actually do that on desktop. That is a web-only thing where you can unlock both of the edges. On desktop, if you unlock one of the edges so that nothing would be locked, then the opposite one will automatically lock. And you can see how this all positioned itself, with the browser window size that came up by default, and would of course reposition if I resize my browser. And you can see that this one here stays centered. Now, as I mentioned before, for more precise positioning or sizing of controls, you're going to have to implement some code in the events. So looking at this particular example here, you can see there are 3 text fields on here. And if you wanted to allow your window to resize with these fields staying approximate proportions, I'll run it so you can see what that actually looks like. You can see here the 3 text fields are completely different sizes, but they stay the rough proportions as the window changes in size. Now you can't do that with straight locking because all you can do is just lock things to edges. But you can do that with a little bit of code. And this is a desktop project, so it has both the resized and the resizing events. And the only difference with those is just that resizing event is called repeatedly as the window is resizing live, so to speak. And the resized event is called when the resize actually completes. Having 2 probably isn't as necessary as it was years ago when Windows didn't show their new sizes live. I think maybe I don't know if this was true with Windows, but on the original Mac operating system, I think it just drew a gray kind of rectangle around when you were resizing, and then when you let go of the button, the window would actually then resize to whatever rectangle size you had. Because computers were slower, graphics were slower back then. Nowadays, everything kind of happens live. But you typically still want to put your code in both. So in this case, there's a method that is called just by both the events that handles that. And you can see the method is just doing, pretty simple code here, and it's just directly manipulating the properties. So it's calculating what the proportions would be based on the size of the window, and then accordingly adjusting the left and width positions for each of the controls that are on there. So like I said, pretty straightforward. And that technique also works the same in a web project. This just has the resized event, but has the exact same code in the resized proportional. And you can see that as the window gets resized, it is changing the widths. All right, the next thing for desktop and web is I want to show you some container stuff here. So container controls are added from the insert project item. So you can see they're right here. They're always called container control. And when you add one, you just get a new project item that essentially looks like, for a desktop project at least, a simplified window editor. You can just drag and drop whatever controls you want on here. On this particular container, I have added a list box, a couple buttons. And of course, you can create as many of these things as you want. So I've, made a second one. And then on your layouts, you can just drag the containers right from the navigator onto the layout to put them where you want. So you can see here I've just added them to tab 1 and tab 2. And as I mentioned before, this can be a great way to organize complicated layouts. Because I certainly, in this particular case, could have put the list box here, 2 buttons here, and then on tab 1 added the checkbox and the pop-up menu or whatever else I wanted and put all that stuff in here. But then you end up with a really long list in your control area for the window. And that can maybe start to get a little difficult to manage if you happen to have lots of tabs and lots of controls, et cetera, et cetera. So splitting things out into container controls really can simplify things. It allows your, everything to be better encapsulated, so to speak, because, your containers only are showing what they need to show. Perhaps you can only have the code in there that deals with the particular controls. So it might allow you to have a better design. And then for the last tab here, I added a couple buttons that will add and remove the container or one of these containers dynamically. So if we were to run this, and you can see they look here, you know, everything's hidden because it's a tab. And we hit the add button here. This is the second container, the same container that's used here. We created a second instance of it, and it is added dynamically to this third tab, which is called tab 2. And then I can also remove it dynamically if I wanted. So this would allow you to create a user interface that, you know, maybe you're adding the tabs dynamically or adding new page panels dynamically because your UI doesn't have a fixed amount when it starts, and the user can change that, you know, like a web browser or something like that. And so you can just, you know, when they create a new thing, you can create the new container and then add it. And to do that, it's pretty straightforward. Like I said, you have to create a new instance. And you just do that using the new keyword on your container control. So I'm creating a new instance of container control 2. And then you call the embed within method. And there's two different versions of that. I'm using the embed within panel, which allows the container to be embedded on a specific page of a tab panel or page panel. So here I'm telling it I want it on what would be page 2, which is the third page, because this is 0 based. And then I tell it the X and Y coordinates on that panel for where I want the container to appear. And you can also specify widths if you wanted to put it in as a different size or whatnot. And now the one thing you'll also notice is that this is actually a property. Dynamic container here is a property that's down here. And that is so that I maintain my reference to it, because I actually have another button that allows it to be removed. And if I just were, you know, doing dim, you know, dynamic container in here, then the reference is going to go away. And I don't really have a way to get at that so that I can later get rid of the container if I want to. And removing the container is easy enough. You just call the close method on it. So here on the remove button, I just make sure that the container is not nil, so that, you know, one was actually created. And then I can call the close method on it to make it go away. So overall, that is pretty darn simple, but it does allow you to start to think about maybe some, you know, slicker, more powerful layouts that your apps can take advantage of. All right, correspondingly for a web project, have a similar thing here. I have container control also added from the insert button or menu. You know, put whatever you want here. I made this one a little longer so that when I actually dragged it onto the page, you can't see all its content. Some of it's cut off. And then I also have add and remove buttons off here to the side that will add the container dynamically. And then now you can see this container is, I didn't use the locking to lock this container down to the bottom edge of the browser window, so it's staying at its original size, which is too small to show all its content. So it gets a scroll bar automatically, and I can use it to scroll up and down and see everything that's on it. And I can also add a second copy of it dynamically at runtime by using the add feature, and the remove feature gets rid of it when it's no longer needed. And as you'll see, looks pretty similar to the desktop code. And I'm doing the same sort of thing. I have a property, so I can maintain my reference to it. I'm creating a new instance of the container. I'm calling embed within. There's no embed within panel on web because there are no panels. So I'm just using the embed within, which is going to embed it into the page itself. And then I'm positioning it below the button. So that's what some of those other values are doing. But other than that, it works the same. And the remove works the same. All right, so those are the popular, common, useful ways for desktop and web projects that you're going to be managing how your layouts are, constructed, maintained. The combination of container controls and the locking is, again, the primary way that, more complicated projects tend to be built, and using the event handlers as well. Now let's jump over to iOS and take a look at auto layout, which is a completely different animal. Works nothing like locking. So here I have a simple iOS view, and I've got a couple controls on it here, a button, table, label. And whenever you add a control to layout, your auto layout section are already assigned certain rules. So each of the things that you see here are identified as auto layout rules. And as you drag things around, the layout guides are going to pop up. And that's kind of giving you some indication as to what some of the auto layout rules that'll be applied for you to the control you're moving around. It'll give you an idea which ones might be applied automatically. So in this particular case, this being a button, standard height's 30, so it gets that rule applied to it. I've set the rightmost rule to tell it to attach itself to the right edge of the parent, which is the view itself, and then leave a gap. And that's the standard iOS gap, so that's almost like a little margin. I've also set the rule for the top of the button to say set it to the top layout guide and to the bottom edge of the top layout guide, plus a small standard gap. And this button's width is set to be 100. Now, if you need to modify any of these rules, you can just click on them and click Edit, and you can get into the more specifics of the auto layout rule. And you don't often need to change all of these things, really. Up here, this is where you could type in a name for the rule. And the only reason you're ever going to need a name for the rule is if you need to access it in code. You can't generally modify rules in code, but you can disable them. So it's possible you may have a rule that in your code dynamically you want to turn off for some reason. You could give it a name here so you can look it up. And then you've got some settings for whether you want the particular values to be equal to something else or minimum or maximum values. And equal is probably the most common one that you see, but the other ones can be used. And relative to is where things start to diverge quite a bit from locking. Because essentially with locking, your locks are always just relative to the layout itself. So that would, I guess, be equivalent mostly here to parent. But in the case of auto layout, things can be relative to anything else that's on the layout. So you can have a bunch of buttons that are all relative to, say, an initial parent button. And then if you moved one of the buttons, all the other ones would realign themselves. And that's something you can't really do with auto layout at all. So you'd have to manually be adjusting everything, and that's even if you're just editing in the layout editor, let alone when your app's running. So you can see here it's showing you all the things that are on the layout, and the controls I've added are the table and the label. And also you always get automatically the layout guides. There's a layout guide at the top and a layout guide at the bottom. Now you may let's go back to this one here. Now you may look here at the, I have the button attached to the top layout guide. And you may be wondering, well, why is this attached to the top layout guide rather than just using parent.top? Which you certainly could do. If I switch this to parent.top, you can see it's still at the top. It moved up a little bit because parent.top is a little closer to the top, so to speak. But generally, if you do want to lock things to the actual top, you're going to want to use the layout guides. And a big reason is, for example, if I come here and I turn on the navigation bar and put in a title, you can see the button is now kind of not really where you want it. You're probably going to want it under the navigation bar because you may have, back buttons and other things up in here. And by using the layout guides, it will automatically adjust when things like that are turned on and off, which is probably more of what you want. The edges allow you to tell you how you're relating the specific things. And of course, you've got the typical left, right, top, and bottom. But you can also relate things to the center, which allows you to have a button that stays centered, vertically or horizontally on your layout, which is nice. Leading and trailing are essentially additional margins, often, not often, but sometimes used for text-related stuff. I have never really had to tweak the scale. I've always just left it at 100%. I don't really know of a good reason why you would change the scale so that, something, I suppose you could maybe have a button that is always, some percentage indented from the right edge of another button, maybe. Like I said, I don't know why you'd want to do that, but the scale would allow you to do things like that. And the offset varies between the standard gap, or you can pick custom, and you can type in whatever value you want. And then the priority, I almost always leave it auto, but you can manually set these to specific values or other settings. And that just indicates essentially the order in which the auto layout rules will be applied. Because if you have a lot of rules on your layout, it may make a difference with how the layout looks if the rules are evaluated in different orders. So it's possible you have maybe some high priority buttons that you want specifically positioned, and those maybe should be top priority because other things on the layout are going to rely on them for their positioning. So you may need to change the priority in that particular case. And lastly, the active setting just indicates that the rule will actually be used. By default, any rule you add here is going to be active, but you could turn it off so that, later in your code, you could look up the rule using a name if you assign it a name and then activate it. And there are lots of other rules that you can add here besides the default ones that are often added. And you can just pick them to add them here. But you have to be a little careful about what you're adding. So, you may not want to have, multiple rules. Like say, if I had, say this was a gigantic button and I locked it, and not locked it, but put in a rule that said its left position was, parent left plus a standard gap, and its right position was left at what it is. Well, I really don't need a width, because it's attached to the left edge and it's attached to the right edge. The width probably isn't super relative, so I probably don't need a width in most cases, so I can remove that. But if I left a width, it's possible that if the layout changed a lot, maybe shrunk in size, that it would keep a minimum size. So those are sort of things that you have to think about. It's, in my opinion, better to put the least amount of rules that you want on here so that you don't have to, contemplate a lot of that stuff. But like I said, it does give you a lot of flexibility. And of course, if you don't want to set up all these dependencies, you can just set things to be, positioned to actual values. So you could just set the top equal to a specific number, just like height and width are. And you may find in future versions of Xojo that that's more of what happens when you drag stuff around here. And then the setting of the specific rules is left to you to do manually rather than what Xojo is doing now automatically. So anyway, let's run this so you can actually see this looks like here. I think this should run. I had some trouble in the simulator, I think during the last webinar. And actually, I didn't really switch that up. So this is a iPhone 4 layout, but I'm still running the iPhone 4 simulator, so nothing real different there. But if you wanted to see, if I changed my phone size, one thing you can see here is the table grew in size. And you can see that's because I have the bottom of that table set to be wherever the top of the label is minus a little gap. And if you looked at the label, you would see that it's attached to the bottom layout guide. So rather than having this particular table attached to the bottom of the layout, it's actually attached to the label. So for example, if I wanted to, I don't know, say move the bottom edge a bit, whoops, I set that to plus, not minus. You can see that the label now moved up, the table shrunk, and now I've got more space down below here that I can work with. And again, that allows you to maybe even, tweak your layout while you're in the layout editor a little easier than you could in desktop and web projects that only have the locking. All right, so this is a pretty simple iOS Auto Layout one. So let's see, I want to point out this other one here. And before I jump into this, Edwin has a couple questions. Can layout rules be added dynamically at runtime? Yes, they absolutely can. There's classes. There's an iOS Auto Layout class that lets you add a rule at runtime. I think I got an example that we'll look at that in a moment. And Edwin's also noting that rotating an iOS device also, of course, changes positioning of things and can invoke auto layout rules, of course, to have things realign because your edges will change. So here I have a simple label and I've got a button and it changes the label's text to be much longer. And if we go back to the label, you can see I have the height set. And what's going to happen here, it's set to be at least 20. And when I run this, and wait for the phone to boot and run, there we go. You can see, the text appeared normally, but if I click the button which changes the label text, everything kind of repositions itself kind of automatically, just based on the auto layout rule. I don't have code in any, event handlers or anything that is checking the length of the string and then resizing the label accordingly or any of that stuff. It just does it. And the button, because of its layout rule saying it's always appearing below the main label with a small gap, just does that. All right, this example here, I'm going to run first. And if I do rotate this one left, you're going to notice that the size of the red areas largely, stays proportionally the same. And that, again, is done using auto layout. And in this particular case, these little things that are right here in the middle, spacers as they're called, are added here. And the main one is the center spacer. And this particular one is, added with an auto layout rule that says the horizontal center matches the center of the parent. And then because this one will always stay centered, these two can now be adjusted to have rules that relate to the spacers so that they maintain their sizing. So by being able to have your controls relate to other controls instead of always just the edges, you can start to do some things that maybe you hadn't considered before. So auto layout for iOS, it's new, it's different. It is planned to be coming down to both desktop and web projects. We don't have a specific announcement or target for that yet, other than it is planned, and we want to get it down to those two things as well. I think it'll be pretty useful when it does, because I find it very helpful when I'm doing more complicated layouts. Once you've got the auto layout all set up correctly, it does make the layout, a little easier to adapt, like I showed before. If your controls are related to other controls, and say you have a stack of buttons, and it turns out you need to, and they're all set to have the same width because they're related to each other, and you realize, oh, I've got to change that width. Well, you just change it on one button, whatever the main button is, and then all the other ones that are related to that share the width will just resize themselves automatically, and that can be pretty handy. All right, the last thing I want to show you here is iOS container control. And actually, I don't. Oh yeah, here it is. View 2 has the add button. So the first one just had a container, and View 2 is displayed here. I click the add button, and it dynamically adds the container to the layout. So looking at, well, let's look at the container control first. Again, these are added the same way as they're on the other projects. You just pick container control from Insert. And you get, a simplified view editor where you can add your controls to it. In this particular case, I've added a scrollable area to view 1, and I've set its content as container control 1. And then above the scrollable area, I just have a button that's displaying view 2. And you can see the container doesn't show everything that's in the container control, so I can drag and scroll it around, much like with the web project, to get at the rest of the information that's on it. And then view 2 is adding the container control to the view here in the button. Now you can see here this code doesn't look anything like the desktop or web code. It's still only, 4 lines of code, but it's a little more complicated, so we'll go through these lines individually. The first line is the same. We're creating a new instance of the container. And then that new instance is added to the view. But in order for things to appear, they need to have auto layout constraints. And this is using the iOS layout constraint class. And essentially, this is doing what you see right here. It is setting the container's top to equal the button's bottom plus 25. And if I put the cursor here, you can look down at the bottom of the code editor. You can see the description of the various parameters that are used for the constructor. And you can see the different things it takes. So the first thing it takes is the first object, which is the container control. And we're saying set the container control's top. And that's an enumeration on the layout constraint. So we're saying the top. And then we're saying set it equal. That's a relation enumeration. So we're saying set the top equal to. We are saying set it equal to the button's bottom. This is the scale, which I'm just leaving. And then we're saying add 25 to it. So it looks like there's a lot of parameters, but the overall order, I think, makes sense. And once you've created the constraint, you just add it to the view. And now the view knows what to do with the control and how to position it, and it appears on the screen, on the view. All right, let me just head over here to the question window real quick. Edwin's noting my mouse cursor looks odd. I wonder if it's doing the zoom in thing when I wiggle it to see it. Yeah, probably. Not sure which version of OS 10 added that feature. I recently, over the weekend, updated to Mac OS Sierra. I don't know if it's new with that, or maybe I had it disabled before. But so I have two displays here. I sometimes jiggle my mouse so that the cursor gets really big so I can remember where the heck it's pointed to. So that's not really related to layouts. That's a Mac thing, but I'm sure the recording software is picking that up. All right, well, that is all I wanted to cover today for screen layout stuff on desktop, web, and iOS projects. I'll get all of these projects zipped up and included with the video recording posting so that you can download them and play around with them. You may find the auto layout ones a little interesting to monkey around with. I want to thank everyone for attending. Have a great day.